It will be with this particular pericope, the second chapter of Luke, that our members are going to be most familiar with, because next to Easter, Christmas Eve, you will probably have the most number of people in the church. And in looking at a gospel like this, and we all know it very well, and we should know it from memory, I always like it when the gospel for Christmas Eve is read according to the King James Version, because it sounds better. Now, in those days, they went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And of course, Quirinius was governor of Syria at that time, and that presents an issue. Now, whenever I look at this, we have really 3 Christmas Gospels to look at. And sometimes you can understand what one evangelist is doing when you compare him with another. And that is for tomorrow morning, which is John chapter 1. You'll have the opportunity to check in on what Dr. Gieshin has to say. And that part of the Christmas story, so far as the Gospel of John is concerned, begins up in heaven, or better to say, begins in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were made by Him. And in Matthew, sometimes the Matthew pericope from chapter 2 is used as the Gospel for Christmas, but that isn't the easiest or the most attractive reading for the Christmas season, simply because it is so negative. Because as soon as we are formed, it begins, by the way, with the alleged adultery of Mary and Joseph's concerns. And then as soon as we're introduced to the person of Herod, and you could write a whole sermon on Herod, we are told about the coming of the wise men and the flight into Egypt. Jesus is already a refuge. You have none of this negative material in Luke chapter 2. In fact, it looks like as if the writer is trying to portray Jesus as having a realm, a kingdom, somewhat coterminous with that of Caesar Augustus. It was a marvelous time in the history of the world. Caesar Augustus had been on the emperor of Rome for about 50 years or so, and a marvelous time of the world, because at that time there was world peace. It might have been autocratically imposed by force upon the people, but there was no war going on. And you get the concept of universality in the word oikumene over here, that all the world should be in tax. Someone might say, well, this is an error. This is an error here. It says all the oikumene. Not really, because this is the technical term for the Roman Empire, that all the empire is going to be enrolled. And for years there was a concern that maybe that Cyrenius was really not the governor of Syria. Here the translations do not properly get the word, because that is a verb, not a noun, and he was governing Syria. It would be he had an office comparable to that of General Douglas Arthur MacArthur after World War II, when he was made really the governor or the president, the supervisor of the Western Pacific. And I think what has to be done at this time of the year is that, and Luke does it for us, is that the birth of Jesus has to be set down within a particular history. And Luke does that much better than anybody else. The reason I mention that is that some of you will have college students coming home for the first time since they've been away from home. And they've taken a religion course or something like that. They have been given a book, and they will tell, well, maybe all of this really didn't happen. Well, the value of Luke's gospel is that the birth of Jesus happened in ordinary time. And rather than give it in years, you know, we have the They're all every nation, every ancient civilization has its own calendar. The Jews do, the Chinese do, the Aztecs do. Those calendars are very difficult to figure out. If they give a number for the year, it's hard to tell you when it was. But by putting down the people who were in charge at that time, it can be pinpointed in history. We do the same thing when we build a post office. We put the name of the president and other officials are permanently engraved in the walls. And it says that all went to be taxed, each one to his own city. Now, this is something, this is not unusual at all. And that is that, you know, the American Constitution requires that every 10 years there has to be a census. The census is to determine how many representatives are to be in the House of Representatives in the Congress, and also for how the state legislatures are going to be proportioned. Well, this has to do with taxing. This wasn't really the taxing. It was an attempt to find out how many people there were, so then they could apportion the taxes, and so each one went to his own city. Now, when you look at a gospel like Luke, you cannot read one gospel the same way you would read another gospel, because Matthew, almost at every passage, is open to a theological interpretation. Luke, not so much here. The purpose of Luke's great genius in writing is his descriptive talent and his narrative, and that in hearing the account, the people can visualize it in their minds. And of course, it is Luke that gives us a Christmas pageant, so our people and even the children know the details. And it says here that Joseph from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, got up to go to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was out of the house and the patriarchy of David, to be enrolled with Mary, to whom he was espoused, she being great with child. Yeah, something has to be said about that. And that this was, Joseph probably had a financial stake in the house where they stayed. We can't change that they went to an inn, a motel. It's questionable whether those things really existed. They went to his house. He probably was an inheritor in the house, and when Mary and Joseph arrived there, they probably intended to make that their permanent residence. And it would be there that she brought forth her firstborn son. Now, Luke every evangelist is a genius. And it becomes absolutely necessary that on Sundays for the Holy Communion, and especially on high holy days like Christmas and Easter, that we preach upon Jesus. And every evangelist does it in his own way. And what Luke does here is that he sets up the person of Caesar Augustus, who, because of his great accomplishment of uniting the Roman Empire, he is presented, by the way, as the emperor of the oikomene here, of the entire inhabited world. That's what oikomene means. Oikos is house, or to dwell, wherever there is dwelling. Now, Matthew knows the word, oikomene. He says that the gospel is going to be preached in the oikomene, and that it's going to be preached also in the cosmos, which refers to the entire physical world. Now, the purpose of this is to use Caesar Augustus as a backdrop for what Jesus is going to accomplish. Augustus accomplished this. He was, by the way, the great nephew of Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar. He accomplished that by force and power in battles. Now Jesus is going to bring another kingdom, and he will be and he also will be a king. And I always like to think that we can find out the motives of the writer in putting forth and how he wrote the gospel. And it seems here that Matthew writes, in Matthew you have the same themes. It begins in the days of Herod the king. The next line is, the wise men come asking, where is he, king of the Jews? Now, a number of things you note there. Herod is not called the king of the Jews. So the evangelist Matthew is putting down the gauntlet. Either you have to choose between Herod or Jesus as the king. Here, by the way, it's a different idea, in that Jesus' kingdom and the kingdom of Caesar Augustus, they're not standing in tension with one another. One is not opposed to the other, but they are coterminous. One is in with and under the other one. Now, in using this kind of language, by the way, Bethlehem, house of David, one of the unfortunate things about many of our parishioners is their lack of acquaintance with the Bible. Now, it might be because they don't go to a Bible class, or maybe because in our preaching we don't use the Old Testament as illustration for what we're going to preach about. The audience to which Luke is writing is probably biblically literate. Maybe not thoroughly so, but they do know certain things. So when it is mentioned that he is of the house and lineage of David, it would bring up the entire story of David. We don't have to. One of the worst things that a preacher can do is to repeat things that we already know. So you get the whole story of Samuel going down to Bethlehem and choosing the youngest son, and David defending the sheep against the lion, and the story of Goliath, and also David's bad points. That would also come to mind. Matthew does that, by the way. He says, and Solomon was born, David begot Solomon out of the wife of Uriah the Hittite. That speaks volumes. But you don't have that in here. Here David is presented as a king. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this at all. I think you do. You know, how does it go? Birds of a feather flock together. Have you ever noticed how one rich person is quite comfortable with another rich person? Do you know that the president of an educational institution is on equal standing with the president of another educational institution? And this is the way it's presented here. Jesus' ancestry and his lineage suggest that Caesar Augustus has nothing to fear from the reign of Jesus, who is going to be born as a king. And it says they wrapped him in swaddling clothing. Now, I have heard a number of years ago, on the way home from the church in Poconos, where we spend the summer, the lights were on in a Byzantine Catholic church, very small building. And out of curiosity, I went in there. And a young man was heading off, a young man, about 18, 19, 20 years of age, to study for the Catholic or the Byzantine Catholic priesthood. And on the walls there, they had a picture of the resurrection of Lazarus. And Lazarus is all bound up in cloths. And this young man went on to preach a sermon on how Jesus, when he was born, was already wrapped up in these cloths. And in reading the infancy account by Joseph Ratzinger, known to you as His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, he also makes the same comment about being wrapped in swaddling clothes. So even in his death, even in the manger, Jesus is already prepared for death. Now that might be stretching, pushing the envelope a little bit too far, but it does make the point. And it's something that people can visualize in their minds. And I'm not too embarrassed to say that I use that illustration in a sermon myself, and that is, if it's good material, why not use it for yourself? And then we get into the account of the shepherds in the fields. According to the sermons that I have heard, that shepherds were the lowest on the economic and social level possible. Now, and also the picture of the Good Shepherd, which, by the way, is not only in John, but also in Matthew. The people are like sheep without. It's not this glorious Jesus with a red robe on. It's a muddy job. And, well, you've seen these people. There might even be people in your congregation who are like that. They have the worst. My wife's father, may his soul rest in peace, he was a steel worker. And when steel workers came home from the fire bins or wherever that was, the furnaces, you don't look very good, like a coal miner. These guys did not look that good. Now, don't you see the magnificent literary work that Luke has done here? He's gone to the very top of the social, good old evolution, top of the line, the greatest developments, Caesar Augustus. And then, to whom does the message of salvation first come? But it comes to the lowliest on the earth, which fits in with his concept, which he's going to pull out throughout his entire gospel. Zechariah is old. And if you have old people in your congregation, you know being old and becoming aged is equivalent to poverty. And I think that's something which we overlook in our churches. How many poor people we have. How many people are living on the edge of existence. But it is for them that the gospel is being preached. It is for their benefit. It's something that I think has to be brought out. So look what Luke does. Alpha, Omega, Emperor, the lowest line of humanity there. And we also want to say a word, there was no room for them in the inn. The one advantage of having a library nearby is that you can read casually. I'm not so sure that I read deliberately, I read casually. And this is the question of whether there was no room for them in the inn. This should be preferably read that there was no room for them in the wedding chamber. There was one room reserved in the house for newlywed couples. And so when Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem, the family put them in that particular room. They didn't stay in a motel. They stayed in a house to which Joseph had some financial claims to. And when it says there was no room for them in the wedding chamber, well, we can just assume that the room wasn't all that big. And when it came to the birth, there wouldn't be you always have to have somebody in there to take the baby out. You know, remember the old movies? It was done in a closed room, and they were bringing in hot water. I never knew what the water was. I've never been there. I was there for the birth of our eldest son. I did make it through. But you can imagine what the situation was. So they had to find a place where she could at least be comfortable in doing this. And he's placed in a manger. Now, you know, many times in looking at a gospel like Luke, and I think with Luke we are entitled to do that, we are entitled to be dramatic. Now, there are no references here to any animals. But they were in a room that was intended for the animals. The closest thing I think I've been to that is once on the Austrian-German boundary in the Alps. We were staying in what the Germans call a Gasthaus, and under the house there was a room for the cows, because it was in December or January, and the animals lived in the same house. It also provided heat, so there were animals there. So there is something reminiscent here, by the way, of Genesis, that the Creator is now with his creatures. I think it's marvelous when they have a living nativity. As a pastor, I would not be up to that, but I think it's a great idea. And the other thought here is, by the way, is that do the animals stand here in the place of the angels adoring the infant Jesus, who was their creator, who was their creator? And then it says right here that the angel of the Lord appeared to them. I like that word, episte. I don't know if I can find it here. Probably can't. He appeared to them. He came out of nowhere. He just was there. And he gave them the wonderful greeting, "Do not fear. Behold, I bring you great joy, which shall be to the people." Now that's a good Lutheran. That's a very good Lutheran phrase. And that here is something universal. If the reign of Caesar Augustus was universal, so also is the reign of Jesus Christ. So the message of Jesus Christ is intended not just for a few people, but for all people. Now, within the context there, it's the word laos refers most specifically to the people of Israel, the Jewish people. And this shall be a sign, and this shall be a sign, the Savior who is Christ the Lord. Today is born today, the Savior who is Christ the Lord in David's city. Now, Rudolf Bultmann, among others, claimed that the Christian gospel was created, or the message of the gospel itself was created by taking over appellations that apply to other people, especially to the emperor, and then applied them to Jesus. Well, Jesus, the world at that time there was no difference between church and state. The emperor was as much a religious figure as he was a political figure. Herod, by the way, that great Herod, he even built an altar to Caesar Augustus and put it in the port city of Caesarea. And you'll notice here, by the way, the titles which are given to Jesus are not insignificant. See, that's the great thing about Luke. He does not engage in theological disputation. He doesn't do that. He uses words that bring along what the people already know and builds upon their imagination. These are the titles which belong to the emperor. And that is the title of the Soter, the Savior. I've always wondered what, I think all of us have, you don't remember World War II, but I think you have seen enough German Nazi movies. They lift up their hand and say Heil, right? Salvation. The emperor is the one Hitler was the one who was bringing salvation. Caesar Augustus was the one that was bringing salvation. Salvation, it almost sounds like a political party platform. Everything is going to be good. Who is Christ the Lord? The emperor, by the way, was Kyrios. The emperor was the Lord, Kyrios. And they will find the babe lying in a manger. And then there was with the angel a multitude, I would almost say, a multitude of military persons. An army of angels. praising God and saying. Now, there is no suggestion here that they were singing this. But why not? That's not an issue. Isn't it amazing? We hear so many. I think people should be reminded that here, by the way, is our liturgy for the Sunday morning. Glory to God in the highest, and on peace on earth, goodwill to men. Now, you probably will not want to get involved in this discussion, but if you look at the various, and it's obviously it's accessible to you, how the various translators handle this, in peace to men of goodwill. One crowd interprets it to mean that God's peace is only for those people who have good intentions. That would almost fit the Roman Catholic point of view. However, I don't even think the Roman Catholic theologians hold to that opinion anymore. And what is great here is that the evangelist at this point has used the word peace for his own advantages, because you all know Latin. This was the period of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the Pax Romanum. Now, it was a brutal peace, but at least it was peace. I mean, you do not want to live in a society, it might be corrupt, but you don't want to live in a society in which your life is endangered all the time when you go out on the streets. This is the Pax Romana. Now comes the greater peace from God, peace on earth. And that's an amazing statement too. It doesn't say just peace through the oikomene, through the inhabited world, but this is a universal peace which is going to envelop all people. When it comes to preaching on this particular pericope, especially if it should be on Christmas Eve, I'm not so sure that we have to go beyond the description of the particular story the way Luke paints it for us. The story delivers its own message. It's easy to be grasped. It can be taken in any number of directions. And put it like this, that without Luke, we would not have much of a Christmas. Thank you very much.